Hello everyone, so today I would like to create a video simplifying quickly the landscape of mental health protocols. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to find and understand what techniques are available to improve our own mental health. And so to start, I think one distinction that we can make, although it is an artificial one, is to put methods or classify methods depending on whether they are psychological tools, meaning that we are using tools that are thought-based. We are using the way we think to sort of change our perception or our emotional state, and physiological tools in which we are directing our efforts towards changing our physiology in a way that allows us to reduce stress, anxiety, and just overall improve our mood. And so in terms of psychological techniques that you can use, one of them, for example, is the Stoic techniques. And here you have various different exercises. You have the last time meditation, where you just really picture the idea that whatever you're doing at that same moment is the last time you're going to do it. And when you see things through that lens, sometimes you can realize how precious each moment actually is. You have reframing techniques. You have negative visualization, which I mentioned in the last video, which is you imagine that your worst fear is actually going to happen, and you really try to inhabit that scenario. And by doing so intentionally and deliberately for just a short moment, you're able to vaccinate yourself against some of the negative rumination thoughts that you have towards that same scenario that scares you. Then, of course, you also have cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, which many of them are based actually on the Stoic philosophy. But here you can find, once again, ways to change your perception of a given situation, which most of the times is actually a very worthwhile pursuit, because oftentimes we forget that most things aren't necessarily good or bad. Those are just labels that we imprint onto our experiences. And sometimes we also fail to understand that one thing can be both good and bad. So sometimes it's useful to question our binary view of the world. And by seeing the diversity and complexity of each experience, sometimes we can allow ourselves to open our minds in a way that is more adaptive and better for our mental health. And so within cognitive behavioral therapy, you have one branch, which I also mentioned in this channel, called the exposure and response prevention therapy, which is essentially you are creating a hierarchy of your fears, and then you are creating exposure exercises, which once again, you deliberately and intentionally expose yourself to something that really scares you. So for example, if you're really afraid of insects, you would, for example, maybe start by looking at pictures of the insect that scares you, let's say a spider, and eventually you would progress towards actually holding a spider. And so you can apply this essentially to any fear that you may have. The goal is just to start off slow, and then sort of like in the gym where you have progressive overloads, you are progressive overloading your exposure to a certain fear. And this can be a very, very powerful technique. Then you also have acceptance and commitment therapy, which is also a very important and useful set of techniques in which you are practicing mindfulness, acceptance, diffusion. And so this allows you to stay more in the moment, to be more grounded, and this can also be a particularly helpful modality. All of these, of course, are mainly practiced with the help of a therapist, but each one of those that I'm mentioning are also available to, you can also practice these on your own. For any given one of these, you can apply the methods that are used by therapists if you cannot afford the therapist, or if you want to try them out by yourself. Then you also have dialectical behavioral therapy, which can also be a way to improve your interpersonal relationships. There, once again, maybe this sort of techniques or therapy is better done with a therapist, because many of the techniques here are perhaps more complex to self-apply. But once again, it is also a line of therapy, a line of thought-based intervention, which can be pretty useful in improving our mental health. Then another practice, which is, of course, free of cost and very, very useful, is journaling. And here you can try out the Pennebaker protocol, which is writing for 15 minutes a day for 4 to 5 consecutive days, or you can even do on and off days, in which for 15 minutes you write without stopping, without really thinking about how you're going to structure your text about a traumatic event in your life. And so you just really try to get very detailed about that event, and you just see what comes up. And so one of the very interesting things about writing down, about journaling, is that it allows us to structure the way we think, and it also serves as a double exposure. Because to one extent, you are being confronted with the memories, perhaps in a more detailed way, because you're actually writing them down. And at a second level, you're also reframing your perception of those same events, because as you write, as you recall some memories, there is some reconstruction of what your experience actually was. And so this is also a technique that I employ a lot, and I believe it is very useful. And then you also have other variants, such as doing worry journals, where you just write down a list of things that are worrying you. Ideally, you would do this in the afternoon, not right before you go to bed. Or you can also do gratitude journals, where you write, for example, 5 things that you are extremely grateful for. This is a very useful practice that has a lot of solid research behind it. And it is very important also because, for example, at least for me, sometimes I forget how lucky I am in many aspects of my life. And so actively practicing gratitude is a very useful tool. Another very important aspect here, still in the psychological tools section, is knowledge acquisition. So actually researching, educating yourself about mental health, about how the brain works, is also a technique which most of the times isn't really mentioned. But educating yourself, you don't need to really go down and follow the academic path of being a neuroscientist or a psychologist, but just, reading about the brain, reading about emotions, what emotions actually are, and understanding some basic physiology behind some of the mechanisms that are present in our mental states, it can be also very useful. Of course, it's not to be used as the main method, but it can be something that can improve your overall mental health protocol. And then in terms of physiological practices, so techniques that you use to really dig deep into your physiology to modulate the stress response, you have things such as mindfulness. As we know, mindfulness has some very interesting effects on the brain. Through mindfulness, for instance, you are able to reduce the activation of the default mode network, which is involved in self-referential thought, which oftentimes is negative. So, for example, when we think about ourselves, when we ruminate ourselves, normally that type of thinking tends to be negative and self-depreciating. And so what mindfulness seems to do is, to some extent, decrease that level of rumination, which actually makes a lot of sense. Although, as you might have heard, for example, in people with obsessive compulsive disorder, some of them will say that mindfulness actually makes their OCD worse. People with anxiety sometimes also claim the same. And here there are 2 things that are very important to keep in mind. The first one is that by bringing more awareness to what you are actually experiencing, it is normal that for there to be an intensification of your felt experience. Another thing with OCD And I think sometimes those who suffer from OCD are too quick to just claim that mindfulness is not a useful practice. In their case, is that many times people aren't actually practicing mindfulness. They're just thinking with their eyes closed. So they're just engaging in their obsessive thoughts, but they're just doing so under the guise of a supposedly mindfulness practice. So that's an important thing. I know a lot of times it is said that there's no wrong way to do mindfulness, there's no wrong meditation, but I definitely believe that there are better ways to meditate, and that meditation, just like many things, is a skill. And because it is a skill, it can be improved. And therefore, I think that before we just throw all of it down the drain, we should try to understand what are we actually doing. And so under mindfulness, under these physiological techniques, you actually have a lot of overlap, because many of these practices that I'm going to mention involve, to some extent, mindfulness as well. So this is the case, for example, in Yoga Nidra, where you're actually trying to reach a very relaxed but heightened state of concentration. Yoga Nidra does not involve movement or stretching like other forms of yoga, and there are a lot of very good videos and free resources online in which you can just try it out and see if this is something that can be helpful for you. There are some good studies pointing out that Yoga Nidra is an effective stress relief tool, that it can reestablish or balance your dopamine levels. And so just try it out and see if this is something that might be helpful in your case. Then you also have self-hypnosis, and I think a lot of people actually perceive hypnosis as being this sort of circus act, but really hypnosis is once again also trying to reach a very intense, heightened state of relaxed concentration. And so hypnosis can actually be a very good tool to allow us to perceive and shift our perception of a given experience. And it can also allow us to come up with creative solutions to many of our problems. Here, a resource which I would suggest, and some work that I would suggest you guys checking out. And if you would like, I can do specific detailed videos about each one of these techniques. But I would advise you to see the work of Dr. David Spiegel, and he has an app in which you can practice self-hypnosis. Then you also have eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing techniques. These tend to be particularly useful for trauma, for reappraising trauma, to also gain a different perception towards trauma. And here, once again, it's normally far easier to do it with a therapist because there is some technique involved, but there are also free resources in which you can try out some self-EMDR techniques that might be helpful in allowing the fear. Because, for example, if you have a very strong fear response associated to a certain event or a certain memory, EMDR can be a very good way to allow you to detach that degree of emotion, or at least open the potential emotions that can be felt in regards to a particular outcome or memory. And so then you also have, of course, exercise. Exercise is more than known to be an extremely important outlet in improving our mental health. There are even good studies that point out that exercise can be a better tool in terms of managing depression than antidepressants. And so, just doing some degree of resistance training, strength training, cardiovascular training is a very useful tool in managing your own mental health. For me personally, I really enjoy doing strength training or just going on a long run. So doing like steady state cardio for me out in the street, not on a treadmill, for me is very helpful, and it allows me to reprocess some of the things that I might be dealing with that moment. And there's also some studies that point to the mechanism of optical flow, that, for example, when we are running, our eyes are looking in various different directions. So there's some shared mechanisms between when we are running and moving through space with our bodies to the actual techniques also in EMDR. And so exercise is, of course, a very helpful technique, essential for our mental and physical health. And so then you also have stretching, yoga, mobility routines. There's some interesting literature coming out regarding how, even though this has been known for a very long time, but sometimes science takes a little bit to catch up with contemplative knowledge. But yoga can also be an extremely good outlet to process trauma, to reduce anxiety, improve depression. If you are interested in reading more about this, there's also a pretty good book by the Dutch psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk. I believe the name of the book is "The Body Keeps the Score." I think that's the case. But he's a big proponent of using yoga to improve our mental health. And many of the arguments here are, for example, that we are holding some trauma or some emotions in our body, and that by relaxing certain parts of our body or working our body in a certain way, we are in a way releasing those trapped emotions. So of course here we need some more scientific work to really understand how the body as a whole is integrated in the whole trauma response. But yoga seems to be a very good practice to also try out. Then you also have, of course, breathing techniques, which are also included in yoga. And here you have pranayama techniques. You have very good resources and breathing techniques. I think Andrew Huberman has a pretty good series on some breathing techniques that you can try out. There's also a very good book by James Nestor called Breath or Breathe. I don't remember exactly, but there are many different techniques regarding breathing, and it's a very interesting area of research. It's actually the area of research that I'm currently undergoing in my neuroscience degree. I'm looking at the relationship between breathing and mental health. And so if you would like for me to do a video specific to that, I would really enjoy to do it. But so really teaching yourself how to breathe properly is a fantastic tool in terms of managing the stress response. Then you have diet. Diet is an extremely important method to actually improve our mental health. Normally, when we think about lifestyle changes, we tend to see them as being less powerful than medications, but this is also not true. Diet can be an extremely powerful tool. For example, there's some good studies that are starting to be done regarding the ketogenic diet and improving mental health outcomes in, for instance, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, OCD. There are some good studies that are starting to be done. We still need to collect, of course, a lot of data before we can say that the ketogenic diet is actually a clinical effective treatment for these disorders, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence and reasons to believe through neurobiological mechanisms that it makes sense that the ketogenic diet would actually improve mental health outcomes, or even that just improving the way our diet would deeply impact our mental health, because what we eat can influence inflammation, it can improve or make our hormonal balance worse. So it is very important to see our diets, what we eat, as a form of medicine. And here I would advise you to read a very good book and read the work of the psychiatrist and researcher Dr. Chris Palmer. His book Brain Energy I found it to be extremely interesting, and it made me rethink a lot of the things that I learned during my academic journey regarding mental health. So that's also something that I would advise you to look into. And then we have, of course, sleep. Sleep is a pillar of our health. Practicing good sleep hygiene, so exposing ourselves to light at proper, adequate times during the day, so early in the morning, and seeing the sunset also, and limiting exposure to our phone lights, devices lights at night, and having a relaxation routine before going to bed. So working on our sleep hygiene, working on our mindset towards sleep, because a lot of times, especially these days, because everyone is talking about how important sleep is, we have a lot of people developing sleep anxiety. I'm one of those individuals who has struggled a lot in the past with sleep anxiety, so I really had to work on my relationship to sleep. And I think this is a neglected aspect of normally when we are talking about sleep. We have a lot of these, a lot of information regarding what we should do to improve our sleep, but there's not enough conversation regarding how we can improve our relationship to sleep by finding ways to, just not be so anxious or catastrophize so much a bad night's sleep. So, but overall, I would say that you need to look at sleep as a way to recover, as something that can help you rather than something that can bring you down. Also, during sleep, there is an important aspect, which is, for example, in REM sleep, one of the very interesting things that happen is that your mind is essentially separating emotions from memory. So essentially, what is going on is that, for example, if you have a memory that brings up a lot of fear or anxiety, during REM sleep, your brain is actually separating that emotion from the memory. So that allows you to look back at that memory and not feel the same amount of fear that you had felt before. So there are some really interesting processes that happen during sleep, which are very important for our mental health overall. And then, of course, you have supplementation, when you have tried every lifestyle change, when you prioritize your diet, your sleep, your exercise, and you still find room for improvement, then there are, of course, some supplementation options that you can use. If you want, I can do a separate video where I outline some supplements that might be useful for certain aspects of our mental health. But overall, I think these are some techniques that you should think about when trying to optimize your mental health. And with this video, I just wanted for you to realize that there's a lot of different things that can be done to improve our mental health, to become more productive. And so I think this is an important realization, because sometimes we try something out, it doesn't work out, and we just believe that, okay, if this doesn't work, then nothing will work for me. But really, we haven't really experimented at all. And even sometimes it's the case that something that didn't work for you at a given moment might work later on. So there's also that sort of magical step that sometimes goes on. And so overall, I think these are all techniques that you should consider. I haven't talked about pharmacology. I did a video regarding antidepressants, and if you want, I can go over more some of the pharmacology science. So because I'm not a doctor, I, of course, cannot recommend medications or none of that, but I can do videos discussing the scientific mechanisms behind certain medications. And if you find interest in that, let me know. I can also go over some of the neuroscience or the neurobiology behind many of the common medications that are used for psychiatric conditions. But hopefully you found this video useful, and let me know in the comments if there's something more that you would like me to discuss. Thank you.